Welcome to this video. In this video we're going to discuss hypothyroidism, also known as an underactive thyroid. So things that we're going to discuss, we'll discuss some of the major causes of hypothyroidism, we'll also discuss the symptoms of hypothyroidism and the major presentations of hypothyroidism, and we'll end by discussing the treatment for hypothyroidism. To begin with, however, let's just revise basic thyroid physiology. So let's start by drawing a little picture of the thyroid gland here. So remember, the thyroid gland is a gland in the neck, and it has two lobes, a right lobe and a left lobe, and these two lobes are connected by a little stalk of tissue known as the isthmus here. So if we're looking from the front, this is the left lobe and this is the right lobe connected by the isthmus. Now remember, the thyroid gland is very, very small in most people, and it can be quite tricky to feel the thyroid gland. In order to try and feel it, remember, it's lower, I think, than most people expect it to be. So if you go to the laryngeal prominence, and you can do this on yourself as I'm talking you through it, go to the laryngeal prominence, which is the Adam's apple, go below that to the ring of cartilage that is the cricoid cartilage. Below that you have the trachea, and you can feel the rings of the trachea. You need to go to that portion of the trachea, and you need to put your fingers on either side of the trachea, and then you need to swallow, because when you swallow, the thyroid gland, which is attached to that portion of the trachea, it moves up with the trachea. And if you keep your fingers in position, you can just about feel the strange sort of glandular texture of the thyroid gland rubbing against your fingers. It's very difficult to feel because it is a very small gland. And really, in most people without an enlarged thyroid gland, the only way to feel it is by putting your fingers in the place that I've described and getting a person to swallow. And you only feel it when it moves and you feel the texture, a glandular texture that's very different to the surface of the trachea moving between your fingers. So that's how you can palpate the thyroid gland. But remember, it is very small. It's smaller than most people expect, and it's in a position lower down than most people expect. I think a lot of people expect it to be on either side of the thyroid cartilage, so they start feeling for it up at the laryngeal prominence, but no, it's much lower down. It's on the two lobes are on either side of the trachea, lower down. But with some practice, you can learn to feel the thyroid gland. So that's palpation of the thyroid gland. Let's now actually talk about the physiology. So remember, the thyroid gland is under the control of the pituitary gland. So let's just draw a quick little picture of the brain here. So there is the cerebral hemisphere, here's the brain stem and the cerebellum, and then hugely magnified, of course, we'll have our pituitary gland there. So remember, the anterior pituitary releases thyroid stimulating hormone that commands the thyroid gland, and thyroid stimulating hormone for short is called TSH. So TSH commands the cells of the thyroid gland to make the major hormone product, which is T4, full name thyroxine. Thyroxine then is moved around the body within the bloodstream. It binds to a special protein that carries it around the body, and it's distributed to all the different tissues of the body, and at the site where it's going to work, it is converted into its active form. So remember, T4 is not actually the form that's going to bind to a receptor and take effect in the tissue. So once it actually reaches the tissue, so let's say it's arrived in the tissue, it's then converted into T3, which is the active thyroid hormone. And remember, the full name for T3 is triiodothyronine. And then triiodothyronine T3 will bind to a receptor inside the target cell and will then alter gene expression in that cell. So just to state all of that again, the brain controls the thyroid gland, specifically the anterior pituitary controls the thyroid gland. It releases thyroid stimulating hormone at a continuous basal rate, and that thyroid stimulating hormone tells the cells of the thyroid gland to make and release the major thyroid hormone, T4. those of you who know a little bit more about thyroid physiology will know that the thyroid actually also does release a little bit of T3 into the blood directly. However, the major one that it produces is T4, thyroxine. Thyroxine moves in the bloodstream to the target tissues, which are all over the body, and at the site where it's going to work, it is then converted into the active form, which is T3, triiodothyronine, and that active form then binds to the thyroid receptor inside cells, and that is a nuclear receptor. It's going to alter gene expression. So all over the body, thyroid hormones are altering gene expression and controlling the body. Also remember that there is a negative feedback loop that controls the level of thyroxine in the blood. So the brain looks at the amount of T4 in the blood and then determines the amount of TSH that it's going to release from the anterior pituitary in accordance with the amount of T4 that is in the blood. So hopefully when the system all works perfectly well, thyroxine stays at a nice normal level and everything runs exactly as it's supposed to smoothly. However, in hypothyroidism, for some reason, the thyroid is not going to produce enough thyroxine, so the level of T4 goes down within the blood. Now, consequently, from this, because there is less T4 in the blood, the brain recognises that, the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary recognise the fact that there is too little thyroxine in the bloodstream, and they then try and stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more thyroxine. So they tend to release far too much thyroid stimulating hormone. So usually in people who are hypothyroid, you will see that the T4 is too low in the blood, but the TSH is actually higher than it should be. So let me just tell you the normal levels for T4 and TSH in the blood. And I apologise for my viewers that are in different countries. So my viewers in America is one of my major viewing demographics, and India is another one of my major viewership demographics. The units that I'm giving here are the units that we use in the UK. I think that they may well be different in other countries, so I apologise for this bit for people who are outside of the UK who may use different units. Regardless, though, I am going to give the normal ranges. So, two of the normal blood tests that we do when we want to assess someone's thyroid function are the FT4, which stands for free T4. So we measure the amount of free thyroxine in the bloodstream. So you remember me telling you that when the thyroid releases thyroxine into the bloodstream, a lot of it ends up binding to a globulin in the bloodstream. A transthyretin globulin is the name for the protein. So it's a protein in the bloodstream that carries the thyroid hormone around. However, some of it remains unbound to that, and we actually just measure the amount that is unbound rather than measuring the total amount that is bound and unbound. So that's what we mean when we say FT4 or free T4. It's the amount that is unbound to globulins in the bloodstream. And that's the really important level to measure, because the free stuff is the stuff that's actually available to go into cells and be converted into T3 and then actually take effect. So the normal range for free T4 is usually said to be between 9 and 18 picomolar, PM. So pico is 10 to the negative 12, so it's 1,000 times less than nano. So very, very low levels. TSH, meanwhile, the normal range for that is between 0.5 and 5 milli international units per litre. So international units, it's hopeful then that this unit, for TSH at least, is something that's used in many different countries worldwide. So I hope that these normal ranges may be of use to you, but I apologise if you use a very different unit system in your country. So that's what hypothyroidism then is. It's going to be too low free T4, so less than 9, and you'll probably have an elevated TSH, so you might have a TSH above 5. That's the classic picture for hypothyroidism. Low thyroxine, elevated TSH. Now, let's talk about some of the causes then for hypothyroidism. So there are 3 major causes for an underactive thyroid that I'm going to talk about. There are, of course, loads more that you could go into, but I'm going to talk about the 3 major ones. So, number 1 although it isn't number one in rich countries where nutrition is very good, it is number one in less economically developed countries where many people are malnourished, which is iodine deficiency. So causes, number one, we'll put up here, iodine deficiency. So in order for the thyroid glands to make thyroxine, one of the key things that it needs is iodine. It needs the iodide ion in order to make the thyroxine hormone. In fact, the reason that thyroxine is called T4 and triiodothyronine is called T3 is these numbers indicate how many iodine atoms are in each of these molecules. So in T4 you have 4 iodine atoms, and in T3 you have 3 iodine atoms. So in this conversion here that occurs at tissues, one of those iodine atoms is actually removed from the molecule. Now, if your diet is limited, if you're malnourished, as indeed some people are in less economically developed countries, unfortunately, even in the 21st century, you can end up not getting enough iodine in your diet, and then if the thyroid doesn't have the iodine that it needs to make the T4 hormone, it cannot make the T4 hormone, so you end up hypothyroid, so free T4 would come down. Consequently, the brain would see less thyroxine in the bloodstream and would try its very, very best to tell the thyroid, command the thyroid to make some thyroid hormone. So TSH will go through the roof, but of course it's not going to actually work. You're still going to remain hypothyroid. However, one of the key things to know about TSH going up through the roof is that when TSH is very high for a very long period of time, it ends up stimulating the cells of the thyroid gland to divide and divide and divide. So you end up with the thyroid gland getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this makes sense because, remember, the brain thinks that the thyroid gland for some reason is failing, and it's right, the thyroid gland is failing, and the brain's solution to this is when TSH goes really, really high, that should cause the thyroid gland to get bigger because it thinks the reason that the thyroid gland isn't producing enough thyroxine is because the thyroid gland is underpowered. So if we make the thyroid gland bigger, that will be the solution to the problem. It doesn't contemplate the idea that we could be iodine deficient. So what ends up happening is if you have prolonged elevations in TSH, it causes the thyroid tissue to divide and divide and divide, and it makes the thyroid become much, much bigger. So you end up with a hugely enlarged thyroid gland in many cases, and that's called a goiter. It's visible, you can see it. So a goiter is a visible thyroid gland. It's a thyroid gland that has enlarged so much that when you look at the person's neck, you can actually see their thyroid gland. So in less economically developed countries where people can become iodine deficient because their diet isn't good enough, then you can end up getting a goiter and be hypothyroid with that. So one of the key things to know is unless someone has a goiter, the cause of their hypothyroidism is very unlikely to be iodine deficiency. And in the Western world, in rich countries, highly developed countries, diet is so good that you're very unlikely to become iodine deficient anyway. So this is something that you will most likely never see in the Western world. But if you are a doctor in less economically developed countries, be aware that this is globally the biggest cause of hypothyroidism. So, number one, iodine deficiency. Now number two, which is the one that's really important to know if you're in the Western highly developed countries, which is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So Hashimoto's thyroiditis is an autoimmune disease. It's one of the most common autoimmune diseases, and it's an autoimmune disease against the thyroid. So I'm assuming you know what an autoimmune disease is. In case you don't, I will state it. An autoimmune disease is where the body's immune system ends up attacking one of your own tissues. So in this disease, it's the thyroid that gets hit, and the body is going to end up destroying its own thyroid, basically. Now, Hashimoto's thyroiditis can either give rise to a goiter, or it can actually make the thyroid shrink even below the size that it normally is. So this is important to be aware. If you get Hashimoto's thyroiditis and the autoimmune disease triggers a huge amount of scar tissue to form, then you can end up with a goiter that consists of scar tissue rather than actual healthy thyroid tissue. So if you do get a goiter in Hashimoto's thyroiditis, it will be made up of scar tissue rather than actual thyroid tissue. Alternatively, what can happen is the whole thyroid can atrophy. So the autoimmune disease destroys the thyroid tissue and it isn't replaced by a huge amount of scar tissue, so the whole thing just shrinks down, it atrophies. And that is quite common as well. Both of them do occur, so be aware that most people in the Western world who have hypothyroidism, it will be because of Hashimoto's thyroiditis. It will be because their body's immune system has destroyed the thyroid tissue. And be aware that they can either have a goiter or, more likely, they won't have a goiter. Instead, it might even have got smaller than it would normally be, and thus maybe not palpable whatsoever. And that's we call atrophy. So that's Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Number 3, and the final cause of hypothyroidism that we're going to discuss, is if you've had your thyroid removed. Now, this is obvious, but it's really important to add this onto the list because you will see a lot of people in clinical practice who are on thyroid replacement therapy because they have had their thyroid gland removed. So thyroidectomy is the operation to remove the thyroid gland. And there are 2 major reasons that someone might have their thyroid gland removed. It's either to treat hyperthyroidism, so overactive thyroid, also called thyrotoxicosis, which is a rarer disease of the thyroid than hypothyroidism. It's far more common to be hypothyroid than hyperthyroid, and hyperthyroid can be extremely dangerous. It can make the heart beat extremely fast and can send you into arrhythmias, potentially even cardiac arrest. So hyperthyroidism is very, very serious. So in people with severe hypothyroidism, one of the treatments may well be to remove the thyroid gland, thyroidectomy. Alternatively, the other reason that you might have had your thyroid gland removed is if you've had thyroid cancer. Now, remember there are 4 different forms of thyroid cancer. The major one, if you're just going to know one form of thyroid cancer, the major one to know is papillary thyroid cancer. 85% of thyroid cancers are papillary thyroid cancer. That is the most common form. Other forms, follicular thyroid cancer is another form. That's the second most common. Then you have medullary thyroid cancer, third most common. And then a really rare one, but really aggressive if you get it, is anaplastic thyroid cancer. Now, let me just talk about the cells from which these types of cancer, these different types of cancer arise. So, papillary thyroid cancer and follicular thyroid cancer, both of those 2 forms of thyroid cancer arise from the tissue of the thyroid that actually makes thyroid hormone, i.e. that makes thyroxine. So they arise from the glandular tissue that makes thyroxine. Medullary thyroid cancer arises from a type of cell that is also present in the thyroid gland, but which does not make thyroxine. Instead, it makes a hormone called calcitonin. Now, you may not know much about calcitonin because it's not really that important clinically. However, it is a hormone that is produced by the thyroid gland, and it's produced by different types of cells known as C cells for calcitonin cells, also called the medullary cells. And these cells can undergo malignant transformation and can form a type of thyroid cancer, and that is what medullary thyroid cancer is. So it arises from a different cell type compared to papillary and follicular, but it's much rarer than both papillary and follicular. As I say, 85% of thyroid cancers are papillary and thus have arisen from the tissue that actually makes thyroxine. Finally, anaplastic thyroid cancer is a bit of a mystery. It is a type of cancer that when you look at it under the microscope, the cells are incredibly undifferentiated. You can't tell what type of cell they are. They're more sort of like a stem cell appearance. So we think that they have probably originated from very rare cells that are present within the thyroid gland that are either stem cells or they are remnants of stem cells that were used to create the thyroid gland. So it's a bit of a mystery where that one arises from. That one is the undifferentiated one. And undifferentiated tumours, they can arise all over the body from what we believe are either stem cells or cells that are embryological remnants of stem cells. And they are incredibly dangerous because undifferentiated cells can generally divide very, very rapidly because they don't have the same brakes on them as terminally differentiated cells. So anaplastic thyroid cancer, very rare, 1% of thyroid cancers, but if you do get it, it's a very, very aggressive form of thyroid cancer. So, if of course you have got thyroid cancer, then the treatment for that, the ultimate treatment for that is to remove the thyroid gland so that you can remove the cancer. So that's another reason to have a thyroidectomy. So, if you have your thyroid removed, of course, you're not going to be able to produce thyroxine anymore, so you're going to end up hypothyroid. So those are the three major reasons that an individual can be hypothyroid. Iodine deficiency globally is the most prevalent, but it's something that very rarely will occur in the Western world. And if someone does not have a goiter, you can pretty much rule out that they may be iodine deficient. If you do see someone in clinic who does have a goiter, then you may well need to consider, is their diet up to scratch? Are they eating one thing and one thing only? Are they surviving on, I don't know, pasta and nothing else? If that's the case, then potentially they could be iodine deficient, but it is very unlikely in the Western world. But if they do have a goiter, you want to consider that. But it is very prevalent in less economically developed countries. The two major causes of hypothyroidism in the Western world are Hashimoto's thyroiditis, an autoimmune disease that's going to destroy the thyroid tissue. And remember, this can either give rise to a goiter or it can lead to thyroid atrophy, and thyroidectomy, having had your thyroid removed either because you were suffering with hypothyroidism or because you had thyroid cancer. Now, let's have a break there, and in the next video we'll talk about the symptoms of hypothyroidism and some of the major presentations of hypothyroidism, and then we'll talk about the treatment.